Thank you, Walter, as always, for your warm and generous introduction. The talk that I'm going to give today is part of the book that you just mentioned that I'm working on, The Other Side of Nowhere or Haunted by Death. And for those of you who attended last year's talk, my brown here, kind of know what the project is about. But for those of you who don't, I kind of thought I would start with a very brief kind of introduction of the project itself, and then move into the talk, which is part of what this book hopefully will become eventually. So The Other Side of Nowhere or Haunted by Death is the projected monograph in art criticism and philosophy. The project constitutes a contribution to an intervention in critical theoretical debates on photography in a digital age and after representation. It will consist of philosophically grounded studies of various sets of contemporary photographic work, from street photography to holiday snapshots, and from documentary to portrait and art photography. Each chapter focuses on a particular genre and body of work to explore and ultimately connect the book's guiding research questions. In blurring the boundaries between the classical traditions of painting and the equally traditionally presumed documentary function of the photographic apparatus, advancing visual technologies today point up and register the ambivalence at the heart of the technical image, as at once representation and aesthetic operation. The ubiquitous use of today, especially digital cameras, the technological apparatus that instantly produces its recorded past realities to be shown and shared with their subjects at once, simultaneously pushes the question of temporality in visual exposure in its relation to both life and death to the fore. A question that may have gained increasing urgency in the current moment of digital immediacy, but that may well turn out to have been at the heart of photography all along. What makes our experience of looking at a photograph different from looking at any object in the world at all is the fact that we self-consciously see the subject of the photograph as seen, as perceived. We look at the surface, whether a print or a screen, at a subject that in and of itself presents itself as an object for perception, but at one remove. The operation of this perception is by no means less real than looking at an object. The power of images to move us profoundly in our embodied and embedded being suggests as much. And yet, nobody will mistake the subject of a photograph for an object in space, a person, and proceed to wish them good morning. What happens then, not necessarily with any photograph, but surely potentially, is that the effective force of the visual surface, its vibrancy, passes into sensation and as such affects us. It is the latter supposition that will drive the studies in this book, each chapter of which focuses on a particular photographer and photographic genre. My reflections variously address questions of temporality and visual exposure in relation to both life and death within the context of contemporary affect theory and vitalist philosophies. At this point, I envisage chapters on Amy Saka's documentary and street photography, especially her work on Detroit, Tom Bianchi's Polaroids and snapshots of gay men on Fire Island just before the AIDS crisis would wipe them all out, Khalik Allah's evocative analog series of crackhead portraits in one particular street in Harlem, which was the topic of my talk last year, the ostensibly traditional and classic black and white, yet radically political portraits of Black, queer, and trans people by South African visual art activist and photographer Zanele Moholi, which is what I will talk about today. And finally, the defamiliarizing studies of places and spaces by Michigan artist Cynthia Gregg, whose images scrutinize the porous borders between pictorial aesthetics and social cultural critique. And the talk that I'm giving was part of a panel happening, I think about it just before the pandemic started. Let me try and share my screen at this point, which went totally wrong when we tried it before, but hopefully not now. All right, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So the title of this talk is From Resistance to Sellout, Changing Modes in Post-Apartheid South African Women's Art. Since the reemergence as a legitimate object of critical theoretical inquiry in the early 1990s, it has become increasingly clear that the aesthetic and aesthetic pleasure, despite the primacy of political criticism in the final decades of the 20th century, have never actually left the scene of critical theoretical debates. As Timothy Aubrey's Counter-History of Literary Theory, Guilty Aesthetic Pleasure, published in 2018 suggests, and as his persuasive examination of trends and paradigms in critical theory from new criticism to the digital humanities reveals, the political stakes of both modernist avant-gardes and postmodernist anti-aesthetics did by no means preclude aesthetic commitments from informing the critical practices or indeed from shaping the political agendas of their practitioners. This doesn't mean that the aesthetic plays equal or even similar roles in the heterogeneous movements and trends of critical practice of the long 20th century, nor indeed does the recognition of aesthetic pleasure necessarily entail a retreat from politics. Shifting art political ecologies have generated a range of responses on the part of both artists and critics to what may be claimed to be an inextricable connection between the aesthetic and the political, an inevitable intermesh that plays out in myriad ways in interaction with both highly specific and more broadly defined shifts and changes in the contemporary socio-political landscape. Jacques Rancière, and especially his concept of the distribution of the sensible, has played a substantial role in the revitalization of the aesthetic in postmodern critical debates. Forging an indissoluble link between aesthetic experience and all forms of life and activities, Rancière defines aesthetic acts as configurations of experience that create new modes of sense perception and that induce novel forms of political subjectivity, end quote. The aesthetic, on his view, is a regime that, quote, reveals who can have a share in what is common to the community based on what they do and the time and space in which this activity is performed, end quote. Moreover, there is an aesthetics at the core of politics that, quote, defines what is visible or not in a common space, end quote. Taking up the challenge of the aesthetic as, on one hand, a form of rupture and intervention in the realm of the sensible that opens up possibilities for the new, and on the other, as an intrinsic dimension of even the most transactional, utilitarian, mundane political process. The pen of which this paper was originally a part set out to explore the aesthetic in the incipient and established art political ecologies that marked the 21st century by focusing on specific works of art or artistic practices that simultaneously problematize and address the content and concrete effects of our hypermodern, neoliberal, global, corporatized, media-saturated, monetized, and data-driven eco-political moment and its mood. My contribution started from the supposition that the complex interrelations, indeed the inextricability of the political and the aesthetic in the founding and sometimes erratic development of regimes of intelligibility, visibility, and identification over time, are particularly poignantly expressed in the changing art political ecologies of 21st century South Africa. In the 1970s and 1980s, South Africa, with its singular colonial history, the country changed hands between the Dutch and the English multiple times from its early colonization in 1652 onwards, saw an apartheid in crisis, with radical, mostly white male and female artists carrying the torch of resistance across the international art political stage. The 21st century, especially post-Mandela, has given rise to a post-apartheid brand South Africa prominently represented by young Black female artists in a global art market. This striking inscription of what one might call a radical redistribution of an art political commons that plays itself out primarily across racial, sexual, and gender lines. The recent surge of interest in contemporary African art is vividly reflected in the recurrent success of the 154 Contemporary African Art Fair. 154 is a reference to the 54 countries that constitute the African continent. The fair, founded by Touria El Galoui in 2013, is the first leading international art fair dedicated to contemporary art from Africa and its diaspora, with annual editions in London, Paris, New York since 2015, Marrakesh, Morocco since 2018. The London edition, the ninth and largest yet, last October, during the pandemic, presented work from 48 leading international galleries from 23 countries across Europe, Africa, and North America. Angola, Belgium, Brazil, Ivory Coast, Egypt, France, Germany, Ghana, Italy, Kenya, Morocco, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, Switzerland, Uganda, the United Kingdom, and of course also the United States. Among the exhibitors, the fair's website adds, it had, quote, a record number of 20 galleries from the African continent, and of the 48 exhibitors, 14 galleries were welcomed to the London Fair for the first time. And now I lost my place, haha. The fair showcased the work of more than 150 emerging and established artists working in a wide variety of mediums and from a range of geographical backgrounds. Coming events include the fair's Paris return edition in April 2022, which includes comprehensive online access to all the participating galleries and artists. The consistent and global success of 154 constitutes an indisputable shift in the forms of visibility and their organization with regard to what Henry Stanley in his 1878 travelogue named The Dark Continent. The 154 website describes the parameters of the fair's ethos as, quote, a platform that strives to represent multiplicity and showcase the diversity of contemporary African art and cultural production on an international stage, end quote. Still, one of the directors of the Cape Town branch of Stevenson, the largest contemporary art gallery in South Africa, whom I met with during my own visit to the city in 2016, Joost Bosland, was rather skeptical about what he called the colonization of African art by the international, thoroughly market-driven art world. For all he knew, the media and the moneymakers might shift their focus to Cuba as yet another place to be mined for their cultural resources as the next big thing. That is, after all, the way a global art market works. Stevenson, why is this not working now? Come on. Stevenson, a typical white cube contemporary art gallery, represents a new generation of Black African artists who are making their way into the international gallery and museum circuit. Most notably and impressively, I think, the Black lesbian photographer Zanele Muholi, sculptor and multimedia artist Nandifa Mantambo, video artist Bernice Searle, and visual artist Mary Sibande, whose work is often highly personal as well as political, and whose in-your-face directness powerfully exposes the intersections of race, gender, and class in South Africa. As I experienced the system of apartheid, almost 30 years after the first fully democratic multiracial elections, continues to be intensely felt in the city, and not always in predictable ways. For instance, several of the most famous and established white female artists who fought their way through the official apartheid regime using cultural resistance as their armed response appeared to be either disgruntled or tired of putting themselves out there. Superseded by a new and active generation of empowered Black, primarily female artists, both of the older white female artists I spoke with were renegotiating the rapidly changing political climate after apartheid, and perhaps even more importantly, after Mandela. Sue Williamson, a British-born artist activist who made some of the most powerful anti-apartheid graphic art, sounded almost aggrieved when she walked me through her retrospective show at the Goodman Gallery, an exhibition ironically entitled The Past Lies Ahead. South African-born artist and academic Penny Siopis, whose paintings, installations, and video and photo-based works have rendered her a highly influential figure on the contemporary art scene, told me that she had decided not to show her work for a bit. While our art practice is, like that of any other artist in the country, inevitably political, she said she was tired of having to make a political statement all the time. I spoke with Siopis in her studio at the Michaelis School of Art, where she is an honorary professor. This turned out to be the same school where Joost Bosland from Stevenson's Dutch director decided not to pursue his MA because of the hostility on the part of the students and some of the faculty at Michaelis towards the Stevenson Gallery, which Bosland remarked they perceive as a commercial sellout to a global corporate art market. The tensions between politics, race, resistance, and reaction on the larger scale of the geographic demographics of Cape Town appear to find quite violent expression in the relative microcosm of its buzzing art world. On one of the last days of my visit, students at the University of Cape Town broke into university buildings, took down and set fire to paintings depicting powerful white people. Whereas the protest started in response to a lack of student housing, and high tuition fees, they entered the headlines of the national newspapers when they turned into a large-scale destruction of the symbols of the colonizer. One student posted pictures of the bonfire on Twitter under the caption, "Whiteness is burning." If these acts of rebellion are symptomatic of the resurgence of racial antagonism in South Africa, they also point to the effective power of the image and to the complex flows of money, power, and emotion in the contemporary network society and its aesthetical political practices within the global economy. A few days earlier, my local tour guide in Langa, Cape Town's largest township, Black areas in which absolutely no white people live, reassured us, his white charges, that people in South Africa are all brothers now, and that Mandela had put an end to racism. Benny Siopis, who at the time served on the art committee that had to deal with the explosive situation on campus, told me that the protesting art-burning students all hate Mandela and consider him a sellout to white power. The committee, all but one of its members white, decided to give in to the students' demands and to put the remaining paintings and statues of white colonizers into storage. It seems likely that that is where they will all stay, as obscured but not quite erased symbols of the past. It is against the realities of both the more distant and the recent past in their persistent effects upon the immediate present that self-proclaimed visual activists and photographers Renée Moholi positions themselves. Moholi identifies as non-binary. Positions themselves. Their first book publication, a collection of 73 black and white photographic portraits, Faces and Faces, published in 2010, is subtitled Our Queer Black Aesthetics in South Africa. Claiming a place as equal citizens for Black lesbians to visibility in whatever way we can, Moholi writes, her portraits of Black lesbians, women, and trans men in different spaces from Gauteng and Cape Town to London and Toronto at once inscribed themselves in two traditional iconographies, Black and white photography and the portrait, and open up a political space of the visible and the invisible, of speech and noise, to use Rancière's words, a space that determines the place and the stakes of politics as a form of experience. As such, Moholi's meteoric rise to the top of an intensely competitive global art world. They received an Infinity Award from the International Center of Photography in 2016, a Chevalier de Ordre des Arts et des Lettres in 2016, and an honorary fellowship of the Royal Photographic Society in 2018, while their solo exhibitions have traveled from Cape Town, Buenos Aires, Stockholm, and New York to Berlin, Amsterdam, Glasgow, Zurich, and Las Palmas, in which critical reception, popularity, and market prowess jointly determine who is in and who is out, would appear to mark a radical shift in the aesthetical political parameters that parcel out the visible and the invisible in contemporary South Africa. Yet, precisely because of the inextricable links between aesthetic and political praxis, emphatically claimed and inscribed by Moholi and their contemporaries on one hand, and the inevitably monetized market-driven operations of an increasingly corporatized art market on the other, the meaning and effects of such shifts, back to Rancière, neither unambivalent nor unambivalently positive, liberating, or emancipatory. Joost Bosland, who had not seen Moholi's global success coming when he first decided to represent them, expressed his skepsis about the Africa branding in the art world from a decidedly colonial and post-colonial perspective, which is perhaps not surprising considering his Dutch background, nationality. Since then, the visual activists rise to fame and their role in this changing art political landscape appears to have come under fire from the inside as well. Muholi's second book of black and white portraits, Faces and Phases, 2006 to 2014, counts 365 pages, and instead of presenting us with a series of portraits accompanied only by a name, a date, and location, this publication includes testimonies, memories, and poetry by the photographer's subjects, as well as a timeline of hate crimes against LGBTI people in South Africa from the 1700s to the publication's present in 2014. The book received a mixed response from Sami Madluli, founding director and curator of So Sesame, a critical cooperative gallery in Melville, which is a suburb of Johannesburg. In 2018, at the age of 33, Madluli, embraced by South Africa's National Archives Council as, quote, a dynamic, bold, and fiercely intelligent young woman who has taken the art world by storm, end quote, was appointed as head curator and manager of the Standard Bank Art Gallery in Johannesburg. In a 2014 review for the South African Mail and Guardian titled Zanele Muholi Frames a Brave New Normal, Madluli praises Muholi's second book for beginning to, quote, construct a particular narrative and for offering a large and heterogeneous collection of stories that challenge what is perceived as normal in terms of sexual orientation, end quote, but that is also, quote, about accentuating a sense of sameness, end quote. Madluli objects to the visual artist's presumed attempt at demystifying normality, however, because it, quote, tends to create a sense of exceptionalism, end quote, and further critically questions the inclusion of the timeline of violence at the end of the volume because it, I'm not sure whether it refers to the timeline or the book, that's not very clear from her writing, falls victim to omissions that are critical fragments of the larger picture of queer studies, social justice, and ethical practices within contemporary society, end quote. If these somewhat puzzling, if not contradictory, evaluations do not quite convey what Madluli is ultimately struggling with here, her concluding comments make explicitly clear that what is at stake, again, is Muholi's position in the aesthetico-political intermesh of both the countries and their own professional moment, a moment that acquires its particular urgency by centrally revolving about money and power in interrelation with race, gender, and sexuality. Faces and Phases 2, Madluli submits, quote, represents Muholi's own practice in the mainstream, which, although largely defined by her prominence and influential role as a visual activist, invokes an ambiguous space between the personal and the public, convoluted by how her work operates between action and commercial spaces, such as galleries and art fairs, end quote. With her parting gesture, quote, given the celebratory and educational context of the book, one has to wonder on whose shelf will this publication eventually end up, end quote. Madluli appears to land us back in the corner of political sellouts that was previously reserved for white anti-apartheid female artists and Mandela only. What all this testifies to is that the role of the market in the realm of aesthetical political practice fundamentally affects the ongoing permutations of the distribution of the sensible in a post-apartheid art political ecology and its changing moods. This, I posit, more than 20 years after the publication of Lancier's influential book, dramatically challenges any notion of a clear-cut and or stable emancipatory or even democratic delimitation of the visible and the invisible, the audible and the inaudible, the thinkable and the unthinkable, the possible and the impossible. Or indeed, as the title of Sue Williamson's show at the Goodman Gallery already ruefully suggested, it may well be that in the rapidly changing, globalizing art scene in the city of Cape Town, and perhaps also in other art political ecological realms, each in their own complexity and singularity, the past indeed lies ahead. I'll stop sharing now if I can. No, it won't let me. Okay. Stop share. Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for that presentation. If you had any questions or comments, you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. And I'll open the chat as well. Okay, Dr. Edwards, did you have any comments? You're muted.
Such a well put together talk and so well illustrated that people are thinking, sort of taking some time to be able to digest it and to ask questions. I'm sure if we pause a little, somebody would have a question. If not, Renée might sort of give us any other insights related to the talk before we go.
Well, maybe what I would like to add is that obviously this started as a conference paper, and in the book chapter, I will engage much more directly and in much more detail with the photographic work. What I did in the paper was really try to kind of like, okay, these are the kind of larger questions that both the production and the reception and the success of this work raised for me about larger kind of aesthetical, political, like problems. And I think I'm very much interested in the aesthetic, as everybody in this room probably knows. But I also feel that the aesthetic has been given such kind of short shrift in the late 20th century, as apolitical and as frivolous and as not kind of very useful to kind of do anything in the world. And I think this work really kind of points at it, is kind of make that kind of inevitable or undeniable that the aesthetic is political, fundamentally political, and fundamentally bound up with political questions and concerns. But that's kind of the larger kind of idea. But the work itself, I think, is very much in your face. It's very profound. It's very powerful. But at the same time, yeah, it's kind of part of what is a corporate, totally monetized artwork. Jamie, you have a question. Great. Good to see you anyway. And not in a committee meeting.
That's always good to see you, Renée. You know that. Yeah, I was really taken by the last set of images, the publications that you were referring to. And I was wondering if you could comment on, and I don't know how to phrase this, intersectionality of aesthetics, or the aesthetics of intersectionality. Do you know what I mean? That it strikes me that these subjects are both Black and queer. And so there's something really interesting happening that, it's races being, there's something very racialized about it, right? But there's also something very, gendered about it, or queer about, like that there's multiple axes, I guess, happening at the same time. And how does that relate to aesthetics? I mean, how can you get to the heart of that intersection in an aesthetic sense? Do you know what I mean? I feel like that's not a very well-formed question, but it's kind of a complex set of identifications that are being given in those photographs, or you're being asked to grapple with a complex set of identifications.
Right. I personally have like a lot of difficulty with the term intersectionality, because it kind of assumes that there is already a place and then that things kind of cut across it. Whereas I think subjectivation is an ongoing process and a kind of congruence of forces that may come from the outside, but then kind of also are experienced and embodied from the inside. But I think that is one of the, I think, especially in this day and age where we kind of constantly talk about DEI and diversity and inclusion and equity. And I think that the work kind of raises questions and forces us to think about how complex those issues really are, right? Like, diverse to whom? Included into what? I think that is one of the ways in which this work kind of challenges the notion of identity and identification very profoundly and kind of powerfully. At the same time, the work is very interesting because it is traditional black and white photography and traditional portrait, right? It's kind of two very traditional forms of photography that are clearly white and Western to begin with, and then kind of turns them inside out in order to kind of present a very kind of different aesthetic surface, but also evokes the politics of the aesthetic that kind of happen, that are played out on that surface level of the photograph itself, if that kind of makes sense to you. But yeah, you can tell like Maloli's kind of objections are really about, okay, why like this is a total sellout, why are you doing this, and you're getting so successful. At the same time, that woman herself is a director of one of the big kind of galleries led by a bank in Johannesburg. So the complexity of all of this, and especially post-apartheid and apartheid, there is nothing simple about like South Africa to begin with, but I do think that its specific and singular complexity allows us to think about complexity elsewhere as well, right? Within a rather like within the global context of corporatized art making, buying, selling, showing. But yeah, it's. I remember when Maloli's show came to Amsterdam, and some of my friends were like, God, you know, why is this like in Stedelijk Museum, which is one of the largest contemporary art museum in Amsterdam, people were not very impressed with it in a way that Dutch people always kind of resent being confronted with their own colonial past. So I think these questions kind of, they have the ramifications that are kind of difficult to pursue, but I think the actual work gives me, this is all very vague and abstract, I think, what I'm saying right now, but like, I think the work itself will lead me to these kind of knots that I'm trying to not necessarily unravel, but at least kind of explore and understand a little bit. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And I take your point. And I mean, I think that's the exciting part of it to me, is that not necessarily you want to unravel the complexities of these identities, right? But just to look at them and recognize them and validate them as existing, like that, I think is the point. And I think South Africa, what a great location to look at these kinds of things. As you say, it's kind of paradigmatic in a way that then lets us open up so much more. So thank you for that.
Yeah. No, it was actually quite weird because I went to Cape Town to actually kind of do, while I was working on a different project, and then the art world just kind of like was so much in my face. And then when I went to the, just kind of traveled around in the city and met people, I'm like, this is amazing kind of way to think about politics and aesthetics. In this is not a microcosm, although it is kind of a small part of the world, that kind of city, Cape Town and Johannesburg, but it does kind of raise these larger questions in quite poignant and striking ways, I think. Jonathan?
I think.
Hey, thanks for this, Renee. It's great. I mean, I don't know these photographers, so it's great just to like learn about them and to think about the sort of South African, art world context for a minute. I mean, my questions are really just like curious, or just like, trying to sort of engage on kind of like meta or methodological issues that I know you've also thought a lot about. And one is like, can you say more about how you're thinking about what constitutes politics in this context, and what kinds of, differentiations one might make between different kinds of political images, right? I mean, it's like in that Rancière quote, I feel like sometimes he's talking about, okay, so within political action or like propaganda or agitation or something, there's an aesthetic moment because, getting people to go out onto the street to protest racist police violence or whatever, there's a moment of being moved by something that you read or see, and you're sort of moved with all these other people to like take action or something. And I feel like the Rancière is like, that's not, what has happened, that's aesthetic also. But here you're thinking about that's sort of not the focus of what you're talking about here. So anyway, so I'm just trying to think, so how are we thinking about, how are you thinking about politics there? And then, like, relatedly, but also distinct, I was also thinking as you were talking, I just wanted to hear, your thoughts more about how you're thinking about the different ways that these images address their beholders. Like, I feel like this is sort of implicit in your discussion of mood and the kind of like the political context of what's going on in South Africa. But I wonder if you can say more. Do you feel like these images have an understanding or a presumption or a desire about the way that the images themselves are kind of imagining viewers or beholders being affected by them or engaging with them or having something happen in this moment of seeing these images? And it was hard, and I was sort of thinking, okay, that's got to be like national or something too as well, right? It's like people in South Africa are going to have one way of relating to these images than people elsewhere, and I don't know, how do you conceive of that? Anyway, this all seems to circle back to this question of politics, but these are just this is the strain of thought that I had going as I was listening to your very whatever thought-provoking presentation.
Right, thank you. Yeah, like I think what I am primarily interested in is how, the precisely the apparent or ostensible contradiction between a very kind of perfect, like traditional form of art photography, right? The portrait, also like of art per se, like the painted portrait, can still do like political work, right? Like, and especially the visual affects us as in different ways than for instance the written word affects us. It's easy to forget a narrative or a phrase or even a word, but it's very difficult to unsee an image that one has actively engaged with, right? It's not just kind of passing by and just kind of looking casually. The work but that holds true for any form of art. I think it requires an active engagement in order to kind of do its work and enable it to do its work. I don't know. I think the politics of the visual and the politics of art are so deeply inscribed in the apartheid years and the art that was made at the time. And this is why I talked about Penny Siopis and Williamson's work. They consider themselves activists. They really consider themselves political activists and used their work. It's like the Hoogland, right? It's kind of like Zamizdat. It's kind of using art to create, to disturb, to also show alternative modes of meaning, being, and seeing, I guess. That renders but really everything in South Africa is like so blatantly political. But the traditions of these white artists, activists in the 70s and 80s kind of show the kind of power of art to actually kind of do things in the world, right? And affect people and kind of also politicize people, perhaps. Yes, and with the, the ways in which the images want something from the viewers, there is a politics of looking, right? There is no way that looking is kind of natural or kind of authentic. We learn to look in certain ways. We also completely overlook things. We don't see things. I went to see this film, The Velvet Queen, last weekend about the snow leopard in Tibet. And it's all about watching for what you don't actually have learned how to see. So you kind of see things, but you don't see them because the landscape appears to be completely empty. And then there are all kinds of animals who kind of are in full camo outfits, kind of like there in the landscape. You don't see them because we have not learned how to see them, right? So I think that holds true with regard to art as well, that there are things that we are not capable of seeing and we have to learn. We can learn to see things differently. Not just metaphorically, but quite literally. I I remember this is really embarrassing, mortifying actually, because I visited Tokyo a couple of years ago, and the first couple of days I could not distinguish between people that I'd seen before. It took me a couple of days to learn to see the ways in which Japanese faces are very distinct and very different from one another, because I'm not used to looking at large groups of Japanese people. But it took really, my brain had to adjust, my mind had to adjust for my eyes to be able to see something. And I think those are fundamentally political phenomena, right? Is that there's no way that there's an innocence in or political innocent way of looking at things. And especially we kind of acknowledge that when we use the way you look at things metaphorically, but I think it's quite literally true. And I think in that sense, there is an interesting, again, like complexity of what the image wants and what the image also forces, but also what the image allows us to not want to deal with. I mean, it's not necessarily productive always, but that's political too, right? Like willful ignorance, we can be conscious of that, but with seeing it, it's much harder to do because we live in a tradition, a Western tradition, where seeing is believing. It's like what you see is what you get. Like this kind of whole prioritization of sight compared to, for instance, smell or feeling, touching. Does that make sense a little bit? I'm not through thinking this, otherwise I wouldn't be writing the book because I would be done with it. But I do think that the politics operate like almost like everywhere in that kind of like this I don't know, it's almost like a knot with all these many different, or a diamond with all these little kind of sides to it, like and the way you look at it really, and what you will come away with depends on how you look at it and where you are in relation to what you're looking at. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it was really just an open-ended question to just kind of, hear your thoughts about these different things. I mean, it's interesting the way that you're sort of thinking about the, I don't know, the agency of the image or something, or the agency of the artwork. So I mean, whatever, obviously you just wrote a book about this, but that moment of encounter, I mean, it's interesting to see you sort of returning to this moment of encounter and thinking about, how viewers are affected by seeing something even when they don't want to be, or when they don't, but still there's something that happens in that counter that I mean, there's an element of chance or something or whatever. But I feel like with this work, part of what you're pointing out is that the photographer is also thinking about the audience, or thinking of, and like, okay, what ideological, or sort of, I don't know what we want to call it on the level of sensation, but, sort of the way that ideology sort of shapes our modes of perception, how can I shift things a little bit, right? Or how can I sort of get people to see in a way that's different than they have before? So anyway, that's very helpful, and reminds me kind of like the way Adorno also like talks about aesthetics or whatever as, to experience an object is to kind of fall into the logic of the object, which then sort of reshapes your subjectivity, and then you like come back out and you're kind of like a different self or something.
Right. Yeah, I think that's like, this is right. This is like really spot on, and what I'm kind of interested in doing in this book. Also, the reason why I have the 5 chapters on very different bodies and genres of photographic work. So the snapshots, the Polaroids will provoke a different kind of response or engagement than these kind of very kind of quiet, in a way, black and white, very traditional black and white portraits. At the same time, all of the work disrupts as well. It's kind of, I mean, I'm not just looking at, boring snapshots of like my own family or something, but and it's all very political work. And this is really when after A Violent Embrace, I'm like, okay, what I'm going to think about next. And like, I want to kind of continue thinking about the aesthetic, but I was kind of forced to return to a more complex way of like, I had to kind of think things through in A Violent Embrace. And like what I've learned from writing that book, I want to use in order to kind of reframe my own questions here about the politics of the aesthetic. That's kind of where things how things go, right? Thanks. Thank you, Jonathan, very helpful.
Were there any additional comments or questions?
But there's somebody, Edward 4. Just raise their hands.
Yeah, thanks so much, Renee, for the talk. You were talking about portraiture as being a kind of conventional genre, and I was wondering if you could just say more about the specificity of self-portraiture and Moholy's work. And I don't know, it's a sort of open-ended question, but what bearing that has on some of the issues you've been talking about with regard to politics, representation, gender, etc.
No, that's great. I was actually thinking about this when I was preparing for this talk, because Moholy has a third book, which I didn't discuss here, in which she is herself is in every single photograph, and she kind of reincarnates a South African woman from women from the 1700s onwards, and kind of dresses up and makes her face even darker. In most of them, she's really, really very dark. But it's the eyes that you recognize as Moholy's. And I will have to do something with that, because self-portraits obviously are very different kind of thing to what you deal with. At the same time, a self-portrait is a very different thing for the person who is in it, the subject in it, right, who takes that photograph, than for the viewer, who may or may not recognize who's in it and may not recognize it as a self-portrait. But I think what Moholy does, and I have to think this through, but it only occurred to me yesterday, damn, the third book is very different from the first two. I have to kind of rethink what I say about those portraits in the context also of that later book. That later book has gotten a lot of flack from critics. People have been very disturbed by it. And I'm not saying that it's so important to kind of read what critics saying, but it kind of does point to what Jonathan was talking about, and the way people are affected by work. It's very diverse, and it's really it's always already political in the context of South Africa. She's getting more and more shit from people in South Africa now, from all over the world, because she is successful, right? But no, I haven't thought that through, but I definitely will have to. It really occurred to me yesterday when I was rereading this. I'm like, oh damn, I haven't really kind of thought about that. Yeah, thank you. Chris, you're muted. You're still muted. You're still muted.
Let's see.
I heard one half syllable.
Sorry.
There you are.
My thing wasn't working. Thank you, Renee, for this fascinating talk. It's all absolutely news to me, and I'm so impressed by the artwork. So you said that each chapter is devoted to a different genre. So I would like to know what are all the different artistic practices that you're addressing. And if there is time, can we revisit the Rancière quote about the distribution of the sensible? I'm not really sure I understand how that's being unpacked vis-a-vis the work.
Okay, well, let's start with the last one, the distribution of the sensible. What Rancière says is, let me go back to my quote before I misquote him. He defines aesthetic acts as configurations of experience that, quote, create new modes of sense perception and induce novel forms of political subjectivity. It defines what is visible or not in a common space. And that's kind of what Jonathan was also referring to, this idea, that there are things that you cannot see and that cannot be seen. Even though seeing is an aesthetic practice because of the politics of could be ideology, practices of looking that are kind of, you know, incorporated by people with unconsciously. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then the first question, so what I mentioned, like Amy Saka, I don't know whether you know her work. It's very fascinating work. She's a white woman who took photographs in Detroit, street photography. She started out wanted to take one photograph per day, and then she had way more to say visually than she expected. So like 700, like you should visit her website. Her name is SACKA. I'm fascinated by the ways in which those pictures are such a fundamental breakaway from ruin porn, because they're all people. There are people in them all the time, instead of empty ruins and dilapidated buildings. And I find the work, I mean, obviously I write about work that I find fascinating and interesting and a pleasure to look at. So that's one. And then Tom Bianchi's Polaroids. Tom Bianchi's Polaroids are like actually from, he took pictures of gay men on Fire Island just before the AIDS crisis. And then those pictures were hidden in a drawer for years and years, because people were not ready to see happy gay men hanging out and having sex and whatnot in the sunshine. But that book came out a couple of years ago. And then Kalik Alas, that was my last year's talk about the crackheads in New York, one street corner. That's analog photography. So, and then Cynthia Gregg's work is very interesting. Her work is fascinating. She has, she really kind of like makes you look at spaces differently. So she has a series of photographs that show us people in art galleries and museums looking at artwork, but the artwork has been removed from the photograph. So what we end up is looking at the subject in something, but that subject has disappeared. And then it's that the actual looking subject becomes the object of our own look. I find it very fascinating the ways in which she plays around with what we can see and what we don't see, and how practices of looking are also determined by, for instance, spaces. You know, respectful, quiet, studious looks at you know, paintings in an art gallery or a museum. And she has another series that she has. She kind of blows up details. So she has a series of photographs of what you call them, sideboards on walls, but she blows them up and you have the feeling that you're looking at like a tundra or a kind of mountain area. It's very, it kind of messes with the way you think you see. I think that work will really, it's the final artist that I kind of added to my little list is because it really forces you to think about what is seeing, what is visible, what is invisibility, and what is seeing or not seeing as a practice, as a political and aesthetic practice. Thank you. Well.
Okay.
It looks, Jacqueline, are you?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
I think we've exhausted our questions, so it's time for you to give your little spiel.
Okay, just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Dr. Hoogland, for giving a very informative, enlightening talk today. Today's talk has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube shortly. And the Humanities Center wanted to thank you, Dr. Hoogland, by giving you a caddy with our logo on it. I apologize for the email. A caddy with our logo on it and a mask with our logo on it as well. So
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to do this, even in a Zoom room. And thank you all for coming out today. Good to see you all.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Edwards, did you want to make any closing remarks, comments?
No, I'm done. Just to remind Renée that we will soon be advertising for next year's Brownback series. And since this is an annual affair, I expect that you will sign up and give us the follow-up to this kind of talk. So thank you very much for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Walter. I will.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.